Ya está en directo.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We're today here. We're very pleased to have with us Clare Daly. She's a member of the European Parliament from the European United Left of Ireland. She's been elected twice in the Irish Parliament, both in 2011 and 2016, and she has publicly defended the Catalans' rights to autodetermination and violations of rights that on the Spanish state. And we also have with us Ariadna Isern. She's a member of the Catalan National Assembly, one of the most important civic organizations of Catalonia and Europe. ANC is the organizer of the massive demonstrations that we've seen the last years on the 11th of September, Catalonia's National Day. And currently, two of their past leaders are in jail due to October's 2017 events in Catalonia, Carme Forcadell and Jordi Sánchez. Today, we're going to have a talk between Ariadna and Clare concerning the global crisis of COVID-19 and its consequences on the working people and the societies as a whole. So just to start up, which measures have been applied in Ireland to stop the COVID-19?
Well, I think it was pretty similar as has been happening around the world. Maybe at the start, Ireland was a little bit slow, but we have been in lockdown, maybe not as strict as some other countries, but people generally encouraged to stay in their homes, all non-essential work not happening now since around the 20th or so of March. Schools closed, universities closed, everywhere closed. We haven't had a government in place even. So we have the same social distancing in shops, all of that. Now we have a relatively small population, about just over 5 million, but we have had over 20,000 cases and 1,300 deaths. So a lot of tragedy, a lot of difficulty. I suppose the strategy of the Irish government was to try and impose some restrictions early on and to avoid the hospitals becoming swamped with patients. And I think they largely avoided that, but sadly, it was at the expense of our nursing homes, where there has been an appalling loss of life in our nursing homes, which is something that I think will need further investigation in the future. But a huge devastating impact then economically as well, of course, with unemployment now at nearly 17%, hundreds of thousands of people being laid off. So with a very unsure future ahead.
Well, in Catalonia, I don't know if you have seen. I suppose yes, that the situation is really not the best in the world. In the way Spain has treated the pandemic has led, and I hope that in the future we can investigate also about this, has led to a lot of death. And now we are in a period that they say that it's to let the quarantine go a little bit, but in the way that it's all this done, it's we're going to be locked down again in 2 months, I think. So I suppose it's also the same that in Ireland, the same case as in all the world, but here it has been done in the worst way, I think. So the government didn't decide in the beginning to stop to do the lockdown in the moment at which we should have done it, like in other countries, that they started in the moment. At least they understood that the things should be stopped. And here there was so much pressure of the big companies and the big wealth companies that they didn't want to stop the market. So we have done it in the worst way, So, and the thing is that we cannot protest, because if you're protesting, then it's like you're using it as an independentist. You're using it because it's the Spanish government, no? But the thing is that we have loss of rights, and at the same point, people are dying, no? So it's kind of tricky. I don't know if you agree with me or not, but yes, say.
It sounds similar. I mean, the Irish government were slow as well. And again, as you say, succumbing to pressure. Like we had the example of the Cheltenham races, which take place in the UK every year. Thousands of Irish people travel there, and horse racing in Ireland is very big business. And sadly, despite being told they allowed thousands of people to travel, thousands of people did. And then they came back and they brought back the coronavirus with them, with devastating consequences on public health. And the government should have intervened and stopped that earlier, but they didn't. But a lot of other measures they were actually okay with. They did move quite quickly and quite strictly, maybe a little bit earlier than others. So, but it was mixed. I think they allowed deaths to take place in nursing homes almost by almost keeping people in nursing homes and not allowing them access hospitals, which meant we had a huge amount of older people dying who I don't think would have died if they'd got into the hospitals. But it almost seems like a deliberate policy to keep them out so that the hospitals would not be swamped. And that certainly needs investigation, because we had stories of multiple people, 9, 10, 11 people dying in nursing homes, staff getting COVID. And these in Ireland are private nursing homes where families pay thousands of euros on a monthly.
Yeah, here also they pay a lot of money to have their people in the nursing
horrible home. And then the guilt that they feel now. So you put your loved one in a nursing home, they can't have visitors, you can't bury them even, and then they die in there. The guilt that people will feel afterwards is going to be huge, you know. Terrible.
It is.
And
No, that I was saying that here we also had this case of the nursery homes, and the point is that there was not even attention. So the thing is that there's so much chaos that they let them there, you know. No one comes to save them. It's like, and the sad thing of all is that the families cannot say goodbye to their lost. So yes, it's
dreadful. And I think probably in both areas, like the crisis has exposed some really the most vulnerable people in society actually are the ones most affected. Like we've had examples here, curious examples where people are paying a much heavier price because of the lack of proper regulation in Ireland. So another example, which would maybe not be normal, would be one whereby we have a lot of language schools. So they are supposedly English language schools, where a lot of people, particularly from South America, Brazil and other countries, where families save maybe their whole life savings to send a young person to Ireland to learn to speak English. They pay these private schools, which are not regulated. And sadly, we had thousands of these young people arriving in Ireland, having paid maybe like nearly 10,000 euros, huge money. Their status wasn't sorted. The colleges basically shut down. They left them there without any tuition. They haven't got the money back. They're in inadequate accommodation. They can't access the government supports, and literally thousands of them have been left destitute. It's an absolutely disgraceful situation, but the consequence of that in some ways has been the lack of regulation in that industry before the crisis. And I think that's probably an example that problems that exist in societies before the crisis are magnified now in the midst of the pandemic itself.
Exactly. We have seen that the regulation of different areas in the economy was how it is now when there is the pandemic has affected people, you know, because if we had a good public system, this would not have happened, no? At least if it, or this private economy was more regulated, now we should know how to answer to this. But there's also in the educational system here, there's also a lot of people that have been let down. But for and at least it's not all. I'm not worried. I'm worried about the economic consequences for these people, but I'm also worried about all the old people that have contributed to society for so long, to the state, and now they're totally let down. You know, it's really sad.
It is, and I think it does pose the question for everybody now: is like it has sort of reframed the dialogue. What is essential work? And those that we used to value the least in some ways, because certainly in Ireland, like we've had devastating health cuts over the past number of years. Our retail work terribly, like, and these are the people now on the front line, and the same politicians who sort of say, oh, go out and clap, say, aren't these great workers, are the very same politicians who passed laws and regulations which affected the terms and conditions of these workers. But I suppose it is an opportunity for us now to say, well, what do we need to do going forward to change this? Because you made the point at the start that the Spanish government listened too much to the interests of big business, and certainly I can tell you the Irish government absolutely listened very much to the interests of big business, you know. I mean,
well, that seems to be a for the things you've been commenting. It seems to be a constant in all countries of Europe and the world. The people who are being more affected by this crisis is both people in nursery homes and retirees, and on the other hand, workers who are now disemployed in thousands and even millions of people who've lost their jobs. There seems to be a gigantic economic crisis coming to us, and what effects is it going to have on our societies, and what's next? How do we respond to that crisis? We've dealt with the health crisis. We're almost over it. Now comes the economic crisis, the consequence, how we deal with that one.
Well, I mean, there's, I suppose, not in the way in which we have been dealing with things up to now is the start. And I think the European Union itself has answered not well enough. I mean, the European Union was exposed as not demonstrating sufficient solidarity when the crisis hit. National interest prevailed. Everybody started looking after themselves, and everybody started looking after big business, and particularly big business in the big countries. And there's no doubt that as a result of the crisis, the bill is going to be big. And we already see people lining up to say that it's ordinary people who should bear the price of that through another round of austerity, as it was had in Spain, in Ireland, in Portugal, in Greece just 10 years ago. We cannot return to that. That's the first thing. Those days and the idea of ordinary people being expected to pay have to go. The idea of bailouts, yes, there will need to be a lot of money pumped into the economy, but if it's been pumped into business, it should be into the hands directly of workers and small businesses, and bailouts of big corporations and banks and companies should come with very, very strict strings attached if it comes at all. And I'll give you an example. I mean, the airline industry has been banging a lot of cages. It's a background that I come from in Ireland, looking for big money. But this is an industry that often looks for big money, and in between the crisis ends up giving its shareholders and its owners billions in paybacks while not dealing with its environmental responsibilities and not looking after its workers. And now in the crisis, not looking after their legal responsibility to passengers to refund, cash refunds now. There are people who've lost their jobs, who could lose their houses, who need money back from flights they haven't used, and the airlines are dragging their feet on that. So any funding put in should be with strict conditionality that workers' rights, environmental demands and other legal rights should be adhered to first of all. I think we do need to see money being invested. The ECB should put money into the economy, but more into the hands of people. It should fund the deficit, fund government spending, because rather than expecting ordinary people to pay for that afterwards.
And Claire, how do we do to press all these European countries to do at least public policy, because or to help the little economy? Because, for example, I have read about that there were some aid to the airline companies to put in order that the people could go back home, and then you find it prices of Air Italia, for example, of 2,000 euros to go back home, or things like that. You know, that it was the people that had to pay this in order to go back home, and there were so little flights. No, so So I totally agree that we cannot do the same as 10 years ago, that it was the working class that paid all the shit in Europe. So how can we do to press all the interests that are in Europe, in order that we at least at once, that we use this pandemic to see how important is the public system, and how can the politicians take the sovereignty that they have from the people, in order to apply some policies. Like, for example, I was surprised here in Spain. I know it's not going to happen, but in Italy, for example, they applied some how do we say that in English? They helped the people in order not to pay the rent. So and also in Germany, they had like a basic income for the most, for the people that are in the worst situation. So this is happening in Germany and Italy, but it's not going to happen in Spain, and I'm so sure about that. And we are supposed to have a socialist party, and it's and they are supposed to be so left, and it's not happening. That it's not even an idea, you know. So how can we make, you that you're an European parliamentarian, how can we do to press this institution in order to be like a lobby for the wealth of people? Because I don't see that coming, you know. And it's kind of I don't see the light in the tunnel. So I always think the worst, you know. And I think, okay, it's going to be always the working class that pays, because 10 years ago we paid a lot of money to the banks, and now the bank should give a lot of money in return. And how can we do that? Because it's this pressure, this lobbying, can only be done from the upper side. Of course, we can do it from the civil society, but it's difficult to protest when we cannot go out on streets, you know. And I don't know, how do you see it from your point of view, that you're in the European institutions? How can we do it in order to make a little bit like I don't know how to say it, to press in this way, you know?
Yeah, no, you've raised a huge amount of interesting stuff there. I mean, firstly, I'm absolutely shocked that there's no payments in Spain. I mean, even in Ireland, and even though it's not a great, we don't have actually really any government at the moment. We had an election where the outgoing government were absolutely hammered. They were a right-wing government, but they, even in the crisis, have brought a payment of 350 euros every week for people who have lost their jobs. But for companies which keep on workers, they give a payment of 450 euros per week in order to keep people in jobs. So if that's not happening in Spain, where as you say, claims to be a social government, that's absolutely ludicrous, you know. I think you make the point as well that it's difficult for people at the moment to protest, and it is. But it's very interesting that across America, even now, a lot of unorganized workers are beginning to organize and strike now, because they've been precisely the people who have been the most disenfranchised. So I think as things change, people will feel more power coming back to them. And it's a mix of what's done nationally and what's done across the European Union, I suppose, for us. I mean, nationally, these fiscal rules have been loosened. And my answer to that is big deal. Like, if the fiscal rules that are constraining governments and preventing them from investing in public services and spending the type of money that you say, well, then they shouldn't be lifted temporarily. They should be lifted all the time. I mean, ironically, the British government now, because they've left the European Union, is going to be able to print money and basically probably pay for the crisis in that way, where we, who are the European Union, are going to be told, no, the ECB can't do this, we can't print money. But you know what?
Yeah, the European Bank should do money.
Yeah, so they could do that if they wanted to. I mean, the only problem would be a rise in inflation, but there is no inflation at the moment. Even a rise in inflation would bring us well within the targeted levels. So there does need to be, and that's a debate that's going on across Europe. Actually, the French, even, and other economies are speaking out. Ireland, I think Spain, some of the other smaller countries were speaking out and demanding that money be pumped in and that workers and ordinary people wouldn't be forced to pay it back. That debate isn't over yet. It's looking like it's, lost in that Germany and the Netherlands and Austria and that saying, no way, we want the rules.
Okay.
But maybe it's still to play for. I think it has to be to play for because people can't afford not to have that in place. And I mean, it is already the case that billions are being put in to big business. So therefore, there needs to be an investment at the coalface, I think. In Ireland's case, in a sort of a joking way, we would say that the Irish government is actually fighting Apple because Apple owe us 13 billion euros in taxes that they should have paid because of the way they organised their tax affairs in Ireland. Now, the Irish government said, no, we don't want Apple to pay this. They even took a case so that Apple wouldn't pay us that money. I think now they need that money, so they should drop the court case and demand that Apple pays. But it's one of the points you touched off as well. Who's going to pay for this? Multinational corporations are getting away with murder across Europe, not paying in any way their fair share of tax. Wealthier people aren't either. They are going to have to come up trumps and pay for this crisis now through a much more equitable type of taxation that we don't have at the moment. But will that happen or not? It's there to be fought for, really.
And also in the European Parliament, there's a huge majority of right wing, yes? So it's kind of complicated, no?
We would need to have a whole day talking about the European Parliament. It is the maddest place you have ever been in. And I'm not joking, but since the UK have left, the most animated discussions are between the Spanish delegations and be they fighting with the Catalan representative or with people who might stand up or with the Basques or whatever. But the animosity that is expressed within the Spanish delegations, I find something unusual. It wouldn't happen in a lot of delegations. It's really striking, It reminds me of the shouting and that used to go on when the people from Brexit were here. It's crazy. But I mean, actually, the European Parliament probably has, on some issues, would have a progressive majority, but it's really the real powerhouses are in the European Council, where the countries and the foreign ministers meet, and Germany and the Netherlands and Austria want sort of more fiscal restraint, but the Commission is sort of somewhere in the middle. The European Union is a very disappointing organisation in many ways. They talk a great talk, but from what I've seen in the 1 year that I've been here, they talk about solidarity, but their actions are completely different, and that's economically, in terms of their social policy, in terms of human rights. So, and that's across the board, to be honest. It goes from the right across the left. It's quite a mad place.
So you say that in the European Parliament is a little bit useless. So all the power is in the European Council, yes? Yeah. It's not a surprise.
I don't think that's a secret. Like it is, it's a very undemocratic institution. All the institutions are. You have the three arms of the European institutions. The Parliament is the only one that's elected. But there is probably a disconnect between the people who elect us and the positions here. The Parliament is probably a little more linked to reality than some of the governments, because it really depends what governments you have at the council. And we've seen incredible stuff going on where the likes of Hungary, for example, in the course of the pandemic, just basically abolished all democracy. The ruling party of Orban gave himself unlimited power for as long as he likes to make laws, break laws, do whatever he likes. And the European Parliament really, not the European Parliament, the European Parliament actually did pass a motion, but the European institutions really did nothing, because Hungary will say, so what?
Well, it's the same that happened in the conflict with Catalonia and Spain. That the European Union didn't didn't defend our rights nowhere. So of course there are European parliamentarians that they do, but they are quite alone, I suppose, like you, no? So it's kind of tricky.
And and you're right, because there are popular sort of human rights and democratic campaigns, and then there are unpopular ones here. And from our point of view, democracy is democracy wherever it is. So it's very hypocritical when you see people in the socialist groupings and even in our own groupings giving out about Hungary and Poland, where the undermining of democracy and gay rights and everything has been horrific. Like the carrying there has been horrific. But the same people are perfectly happy and don't like Spain being mentioned anywhere because of the. It's crazy, or Bulgaria or other countries. But to me,
or in Hungary, they are against what happens in Hungary, but then in Spain, well, nothing.
Yeah, it's crazy. And that's, unless the European Union starts to address, on the one hand, its neoliberal economic policies, and on the other, its love of lecturing people outside the European Union about human rights and democracy, and then turning a blind eye to the members of the club internally, not saying the unpopular things because you don't want to offend whatever government is.
Spanish friends, yes. It's like a club of friends, no? It's a club of elitist friends that they seem like they are the guarantee of democratic rights, and it's all cynical,
It's crazy. We have a report at the moment. I'm actually doing the annual report on fundamental rights and adherence with fundamental rights in the European Union. And I have tried, as the rapporteur of the file, to bring in, to name countries and not the usual ones. So I want Spain named in relation to Catalonia, and I have a number of references. And there is a huge fight actually going on at the moment. People don't want Spain mentioned in it, and that's actually true, which is pretty sad, really, because
that it's also the job of the Spanish foreign ministry I don't know what they are doing, but they are sabotaging. I don't know if it's a word. All their interests in order that Spain doesn't appear anywhere,
It's incredible for me. Like, I found it since coming here, I found it absolutely shocking. Like, I mean, I have no vested interest in this situation. I've no particular, but it's such common sense, like, and it's like, why would anybody, be silent about what's going on when you see the attack on democracy, when you see members of parliament in prison and staying in prison in the midst of a pandemic when others are being let out? It's incredible, the silence. When
and also like our former president of the ANC, so he's in prison for more than 3 years already, and
I met him. He's doing all right. I know. I went to visit him there earlier in the year, just before the pandemic. We went and we had a visit, and I got to meet him. And look, they're an incredibly impressive group of people. They're really keeping their spirits up. But
they're very strong.
Oh, it was incredible. But we just found it shocking. Like, it was a delegation of members, MEPs from different countries and different groups. But we couldn't really believe it then when, the COVID comes out and all of the guidelines in saying globally, in the interest of public health and to comply with social distancing, that people should be let out of prisons. And these, the Catalan prisoners, political prisoners, were so clearly met the definition of the types of people who should be let out of prison. And yet you see the vindictiveness is something that I found really, really shocking. And the extent of the sentences that they got, and I suppose even worse, the total lack of any serious conversation in Europe about these, because I think most people across Europe probably are unaware of the scale of the attack.
That's the thing. Only when Puigdemont was in exile, he could someday take out in the news, but that's it. So, yeah. Well, now that he's European parliamentarian, then perhaps he can spread more the voice.
I met him the other day. Yes, he is. He was going to his committee meeting with the all remotely. Well, we were here because we are in Brussels at the moment. So when we're here, we can come into the Parliament, but very few people are. But of course, the High Representative Borrell was attending the meeting remotely, but so we didn't get to see him in person. But we like to freedom of Catalonia when we can.
Okay, good.
You've been talking a lot about the European institutions and the European Parliament and the response we're getting on during this crisis and the last few years. And we've recently seen an increase on Euroscepticism in some countries as a consequence of the reaction of the European Commission and Parliament during this crisis. For example, in Italy, it's been going up a lot, and we've seen the same in the countries that have been affected the most by the coronavirus. Uh, how should the European institutions react instead of how they're doing it in order to, well, keep existing at first and then solve all the problems in Europe? What's the main thing that needs to be solved in the European Parliament and European institutions to make the people believe in them and happy about them?
Well, for me, I mean, I think this has been coming for a long time. I think a lot of citizens across Europe have been completely alienated from the European institutions because they have been largely in place to further the interests of the European arms companies and military institutions and European big business and big farmers, and at many in many ways at the expense of the citizens. Now, despite that, countries like Ireland have a really high rating, although interesting, as you say, in recent times it has diminished. So since at the time of Brexit, Irish people were like 95% in favour of the European Union. Now it's gone down to 83%, which is a big enough leap, but not big. But countries like Italy, I have no doubt now that Italy will leave if they are forced to pay the price of this crisis without any serious solidarity. And by serious solidarity, I mean money. Then I've no doubt that it is the beginning of the end, and Italy will leave the European Union and it will unravel. So in order to protect itself, what it needs to do is break away from the fiscal restraints that it has bound itself in since its inception, because the fiscal rules are there to whip the smaller countries and the vulnerable into line. They're saying they're temporarily easing them. For me, to save the European Union, they need to be broken. So the rules on sort of that you can only spend 3% of GDP, that you have to keep your budget, your debt in line, that you and state aid rules, they need to be lifted permanently to allow governments to invest in the productive parts of the economy. We need to relocate some industries back. We need to revise our trade policy. It's not just about Europe, it's about the world now. And I do think that a sort of environmentally sustainable but real Green Deal, not the sort of weak European Union one, but investment in proper sustainable jobs and so on, needs to be made to build a recovery. And to pay for that, well, the ECB should print money. It has the capacity to do that, not put it in the hands of the banks as it did the last time, but more directly into the hands of small businesses and citizens, and provide a backup there. As I say, I think there is the space to do that, and they should. But we also certainly need to look at tightening tax loopholes and some of the biggest people with the money being made to pay for that. Now, unless they do that, so unless they change everything they've been doing up to now, then I think the Euroscepticism you talk about is going to continue anyway. Because on the one hand, we have this in the old, what we call, I suppose, Western Europe. But in Eastern Europe, the situation is unbelievable as well. You have some countries moving to authoritarian rule. You have maybe some of the old elites in some of the old former Eastern Bloc countries have remodeled themselves as the new leadership. In many countries, they're siphoning off the European Union funds for themselves. Their citizens are pauperized. A lot of the countries have huge problems with corruption, and the European Union does nothing. They're happy to have them there. If they're members of NATO and it keeps the American happy, that's the way it is. So, I mean, that's a roundabout way of saying Europe needs to do everything different if it's going to survive. I don't see it surviving unless it changes tack, because it's failed on so many fronts, and the crisis really brings that home, I think.
I totally agree with you. And also, I think one important thing is that they are not doing at all. It's fighting the extreme right, that it's growing in all these countries, that the Euroscepticism is growing. they are doing nothing. So how can we tolerate that there's extreme right in the European Parliament? And so it's so for me the only way that the European Union resists and that I could follow it and I could feel that it's something that helps the democracy and my country would be that as you say, all the things that you said is that they they began to invest on the wealth of people, not on the wealth of the business in Europe, and also I think that it needs a big institutional change. So for me, the European Parliament has a little power. All the power is in the European Commission or in the European Council. So I don't know what do you think about the European Commission, but there's the internal democracy of the European Union has to change, and this not only depends on the Euro parliamentarians, but also on the government of each country. So for me, I'm not really hopeful of how the European Union is going to go, and if they continue in this way, in this neoliberal way of thinking that it's only the interest above the people, then it's going to be difficult that it sustains on the future. So.
Yeah, look, I mean, you're totally right. And for us coming here to see the extreme right is something that we don't see in that way in Ireland. It's not something, maybe because of the struggles in Ireland against colonialism and so on. We don't really have that far right tradition. Okay, we had a bit of it, a long story, but we haven't seen it in the brute way in which it can be expressed in the European Parliament. But I actually think, far from not doing anything about it, the actions of the European institutions are adding to the problems, because rather than actually tackling the root causes, which is giving rise to the rise of the far right, which is the growing inequality in Europe and the fact that so many citizens are being left behind, rather than doing, they talk in all this sort of politically correct language, which is actually meaningless. You know, they have words like democracy, fundamental rights, but they don't mean anything, because they just apply them to who they like and ignore them with others. So that is a huge problem. Many of the European countries are involved in wars and militarism, which has given rise to refugees in the first place. And then these are the same companies which benefit from the contracts, which want to erect our borders. And so much of the narrative in the European institutions is about refugees, keeping asylum seekers out. They don't say that, of course, they uphold the rule of law, but they actually don't. And the crisis has really revealed that, with the terrible situation on the islands of Greece, where we have 40,000 people in a space for maybe 5,000. Europe has known about this for a long time. Spain and Italy and Malta and Greece have been, have had more refugees landing there, but because of the Dublin Agreement, the other countries haven't, if you like, stepped in and moved them on, as it were, or spread them out in a more sustainable manner across Europe. So we have the refugee
There is one reason also. There is one reason also, because I want that Catalonia has a country, because we have fight for this a lot, for the immigrant rights and for the refugees, and we don't have the right to have this policy because it's a state policy. So we want to host the refugees and we cannot do it. So and at the same way, it's so easy for the working class, for the people to say that the one that is in a worse situation than you is the one that is taking you from your rights and it's I always think that the one that takes rights is the one that has white gloves. I don't know how if this expression is in English, right? So the the one that is taking you the right is the. You have it? Okay.
Well, I think we call them white collar criminals. So they're
okay.
criminals. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you have understood me. It's okay. So, I don't know. I am worried about that in Spain, because we have a big extreme right party, and also in countries like France or Italy also. So it's kind of creepy. So
yeah. And I mean, what's the scariest part is that, and you've seen it, like the new government in Greece is quite right wing, so they haven't dealt with. Now there were problems there anyway, but when you combine it with the new government, and there's been an unleashing of sort of violent right wing extremism against asylum seekers, against doctors, against NGOs who've tried to help incredibly vulnerable people during the crisis. Malta basically closed its barriers, ignored international law, was saying that people should be disembarked in Libya, where clearly nobody, at least on
Wants to
paper,
be there.
anybody should be put. So crazy stuff. So again, it's this hypocrisy. It's not just the far right, but they're being facilitated in this agenda. And Ursula von der Leyen went out to Greece and said, oh, we're with Greece. You are our shield. In other words, sort of saying you're protecting our European borders, but not saying to them, what about upholding international law and the right to asylum? I mean, it's ironic that at the moment the Iran is facing great difficulty in dealing with the pandemic because of the sanctions, but there are 3 million Afghan refugees in Iran, in the midst of sanctions, and in the midst of Europe in its total has maybe 2 million or something. With no sanctions, it's nothing. It's crazy. But
it's cynical. It's cynical.
It's a big part. But you're right. I mean, the far right use this, and it's easy for people to think, oh, it's this person coming and taking my job, when in actual fact, the contribution of refugees and asylum seekers to Europe has been absolutely immense. It's a positive contribution culturally and economically. It's been hugely beneficial for the European economies, as the Germans found out. I mean, they took in 1 million, and they were clever. They knew what they were doing.
And only as an example of an essential work, like here, to pick up all the fruit in Lleida, in a region in Catalonia. They were looking for people because they couldn't host all the immigrants, and normally they do this because no one wants to do it. So now we have seen that as an essential work, it is something that we need them, So of course.
That's a very good example, because in Ireland we had one of the big scandals in the COVID crisis and it's an area where I'm from, near the airport, where a big kind of big agricultural producers of strawberries and fruit and all actually shipped in a plane full of Bulgarian workers in order to harvest, saying that this was essential work. Now, this is when within the surrounding area there are probably, maybe 100,000 people out of work at the moment in that vicinity. Probably have volunteered to help even for nothing to get out of their house if they could. Instead, they brought a plane load, and it's going to be one of many.
Well, also it's in order to pay less, to have less rights, etc. So yeah,
that's exactly what it is, because obviously I believe every worker, I welcome any worker who wants to come and work in Ireland, but this company is recruiting in Bulgaria because it knows it can abuse and exploit these people the way in which Irish people were exploited over the years when we went to work everywhere. They have bogus recruiting agencies, they charge them for their flights, they charge them for their accommodation, and they totally exploit them. And the fact that they were prepared to do that in the midst of a pandemic, jeopardizing also their health and public health, actually caused outrage. So in a sense, it was kind of a good thing that it put the spotlight on these exploitative practices of migrant workers in a way in which hadn't been put on it before. And I think in that sense it was quite good. But even here we did see some Irish people try to use it for racist purposes as well, which shows that those arguments can be developed anywhere and in any circumstance.
Yeah, they can be switched in the other way around as always. Yes.
Yeah.
You were talking before with a problem with the military in some countries that are seeing the rise of the right wing. You were putting the example of Greece using the army against refugees trying to cross its borders. And it's a problem that we've seen too with this new crisis. Local police bodies and police corps all around the world have now more power in their hands in order to control the population during the pandemic. It also has a consequence in many countries of militarizations, with seeing the armies march on the streets. We've seen this in Catalonia and Spain, with the Spanish army supposedly coming to help, we're seeing kind of an excuse for militarization and authoritarianism. Is this something that you see staying after the crisis? We're gonna have trouble fighting back on these new powers that the police are getting and the consequences it will have?
Well, sadly, yes, I do. And I suppose it depends on where you're starting from. And it comes back to this idea of the European Union being quite different, being made up of different member states where it's different. So if you take a country like Ireland, where we're supposed to be militarily neutral, we do allow the US military to use our airport, which is another story I could go on about for hours, and we shouldn't, but that's a long story. But in any case, the Irish Army would be very well received in Ireland. They're highly respected, and people would like them. So they never would be out in the streets in that way. You take a country like France, or probably Spain, with different traditions. It's a much more threatening force. And even in Italy, the police and the army can be much more threatening when they're there. So I do think we've already seen it in France. Some laws being, France is basically becoming almost a police state. And with the current government that's there, it's highly unlikely that some of the measures that they've adopted will be lifted. Now, fundamental rights and human rights can be, I suppose they're not absolute. They can be waived in circumstances where there's a bigger fight to be had, if you like. So public health, for example. So, our right to liberty and roam the streets can be legally curtailed, but the measures to curtail them must be proportionate, necessary, the only way, and they must be time limited. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the measures being put forward in some countries, I do think are going to be seized upon, along with all the new surveillance. I mean, there's a big conversation starting now about the new tracing apps, and Big Brother is really watching us now, because this whole level of surveillance is going to ratchet up a gear. So how we deal with these issues, I mean, at the moment, if you were in Italy, say, 5 weeks ago, I think the people would want the army and the police to be strict with people who were maybe not adhering to social distancing. But, that will obviously change. If they were to continue doing that in the next couple of weeks, people would say, no way. But the problem is, if you give them the power and you don't limit it time-wise, it's very difficult for them to loosen up on that later on. So it's a big, big concern for sure. And anybody who's interested in civil rights needs to be very attentive to these measures, and needs to be putting all of their politicians under huge pressure in this regard.
Well, we have seen in Spain that they have profited from the pandemic issue to put the militaries everywhere. Also in the screens, when Pedro Sanchez had to talk, there was a military guy talking and talking about issues that had to do nothing with military stuff. So he was talking about something that it should be a doctor talking there. And also they have, it's something we should be worried, as you were saying, because they abuse from their power a lot. So they are here in Barcelona. They have done a campaign like this was like a refugee camp with lots of tents, and we don't need tents with militaries here. It's kind of they are using a very critical situation for people to put the militaries everywhere, because they don't know what to do with them. And also, I hope this helps, at least in the other way, as a positive thinking, to that the people see why are they doing this. So I mean, there have been a lot of information going on, and people were comparing all the money invested on military army in Spain, and for example, how much cost a Eurofighter in compared with 25 hospitals or things like that. No, so So I hope that in the other way around, we have the capacity to inform the people in where is the best place to invest. And what scares me a little bit is that when this finishes, that I hope it finishes soon, how can we take them off from here? How can we take them off of our lives? Because they are all the time doing like they're doing like marketing shows. They were last week cleaning a nursery home that it was a private nursery home, not even a public one, and they were cleaning it. So this is not something that the militaries have to do. They also did like a show to try to clean the Barcelona airport. It's all like a facade. I don't know how to say it. So it's scary in the way they are. Now that we are in a political conflict, and that we for us for example for the 1 of October, the memory that we have of the army, the Spanish army, is that they are people against us, that they there's not people that's going to help us from anything, and it's like it's scary. It's not nice. So for me to see a military guy on the street, it's not something that I say, oh, I'm so cool now. I have someone that is going to protect me. No, I think that it's someone that is occupying my streets and it's going to go against my people, like they did 3 years ago in the 1 of October of 2017. So I don't know how are we going to protest about that with this new coronavirus situation, but it's kind of scary.
I think you're totally right. And I mean, I suppose the first thing that anybody can do and has to do is exactly as you have done, be cognizant of the enormous danger that the present situation brings about. Now, it is linked to traditions in countries. And I suppose from that point of view, it's particularly worrying in a Spanish sense, in that, if you like, Spain as a democracy, if you could call it that, that's maybe another debate. But the road to democracy from like the Franco era is not really that far away. And,
No.
that fascist authoritarian past, there are still elements that were party to that and involved in that and still have that way of thinking. And therefore, when you combine that with the actions of the Spanish military, and what they've done recently, then you're totally right that the present scenario in some ways gives them a license to do what in normal times they would never get away with, because people would say, well, this is a step too far. So that's the first thing, is to recognize the danger. And then it is a case of just putting the pressure on, because I do think you're right that we shouldn't be too negative about the present situation. It's difficult now when we're still kind of in lockdown, when people are a little bit scared about the future, both in terms of health, but probably more so even economically. But at the same time, the responses in countries have given people a vision of what is possible. It's been possible, like, to pay people 350 euros every week in Ireland in social welfare payments. So people are saying, well, if it's possible to do that now in response to a crisis, like, why can't we be doing that all the time? They've been able to find billions to shore up certain parts of the economy, to release funds, why can't they do that for the things that ordinary people need? And it shows, I suppose, what's important and what isn't. And we have seen huge demonstrations of solidarity between people and within communities and self-organization. And they are the positives that we need to take from it to organize as well. I do
Exactly.
think
And the people have the balance of the investments on the military army. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I mean, it's that there are a lot more of us than them, if you like, throughout Europe, so it is difficult to mobilize people at the moment, but there is a battle for heart and mind on at the moment, for sure. And within to that, there are a lot of people who believe that we can't go back to normal, because the old normal was part of the problem, and they don't want the solution to be, greater militarism or authoritarianism. They want something more based on real solidarity and real cooperation.
No, I was saying before that I stopped you sorry that I think that it's positive that people are opening their eyes and seeing what is important, and in this balance they say militaries are not important. Militaries are more scary to me than the investment of state in health system, you know. And I think this is at least I try to be positive on that this opens minds to people to really see what is important
Well,
in the birth of citizens. So I
and you're
hope
right.
this
And
makes things.
if it helps, it is also the case that at a security and defence meeting here last week, some representatives of the military were talking to some of the MEPs at the meeting and saying how they were worried. They were saying now our budgets might come under attack now in this, and we have to defend our budgets. But it shows the point you're making is absolutely true. They realise that most sane people realise that wasting money on militarism in the current climate, and particularly when they are one of the biggest contributors to the carbon footprint also. So it's not just the financial cost, it's the environmental cost, you know, I think is a
Also, yeah.
positive. And we should take a positive from the fact that, you know, young people and the new generation were able to put environmental issues center stage. So we can take, I suppose, that idea forward now post-COVID as well, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, also the pandemic has helped the environmental fight. So now in Barcelona we see the sea because it was before, it was a very black smoke on it. So I think this also has opened the eyes to people to see how our fastened lives keep on destroying our cities and our health. No,
It's
so
incredible,
yeah.
like the change so quickly to our environment in places like Venice and around the world, like people could see it in cities in India and so on, really means we can see the environmental damage, which is good in a mad way that people realize that. The scary bit is, of course, it's already started here that the far right in the European Union and the climate deniers, of which there are some even still, despite that evidence, are now saying we can't be wasting money on green initiatives now. We need to give our money to our farmers or whatever. Whereas the reality is that all investment now has to be green. And there is a huge opportunity in the crisis to put people to work around proper environmentally sustainable programs, and even things like our air transport or so on. We now have a chance, if the airlines are looking for investment, for that to be tied to changes in environmental
Yeah.
practice and so on.
Mhm. Yeah, in reality, in a positive way of thinking, new industries could appear in the sustainable market in a sustainable way of thinking, you know, and it could be sustainable jobs also, you know. So yeah,
Big
and
time.
it's
I
good
think they
to see
realise that.
the evidence that now we can breathe better in Barcelona. You know, it's something that everyone can see. It's not only that I have to convince I convince someone about how important is a sustainable policy. It's that you can breathe better. You're seeing this. You're seeing that the sky is blue. So I think this, in a positive way of seeing all this situation, this is a good thing that we don't need anymore to convince people about the importance of that.
And I think you're right. I mean, I think, and there has been some discussions here on a more positive note, like in relation to the big impact on tourism of the crisis. And obviously, Barcelona, for example, I'm sure other parts of Catalonia would benefit hugely from tourism. But there is a recognition now, which is quite positive, that tourism cannot return to the way it was. So this
Exactly.
idea of areas where there were over tourism, I'd imagine the likes of sort of, you know, the Costa del Sol type holidaying and so on, just cannot continue, of cheap flights,
No.
environmental destruction. So a much more sustainable tourism, locally based within Europe, where people would holiday nearer to where they live, and, you know, in a more sustainable manner, I think needs to be explored further.
Changing a little bit, going to another subject, how has this crisis affected the relations between Northern Ireland and independent Ireland?
Well, I don't know. I mean, look, we are an island. The border hasn't been put back on it or anything, so it's very much a kind of an island economy in some ways, with a smooth movement across, even though the health service and that would be quite different in Ireland, north and south. But yeah, I mean, on a practical level, I suppose it hasn't made a huge amount of difference. Life in Ireland, I suppose the biggest worry people had with Brexit was the idea that there might be a border put back on the island of Ireland. Nobody wants that. That position has held so far, I suppose. So that's something that we absolutely have to maintain for sure. But in terms of a direct COVID link, well, I haven't really been there for the crisis, so I don't really know. It's not something I've heard discussed all that much. But, you know, as I say, the cooperation was there in any case, you know.
Well, to start closing with this talk, very insightful thought. We have a couple questions related to sovereignty and autodetermination, and some questions that people have asked us on the chat during this talk. So give me a second. First of all, there's one of the people who's listening to us says if the international image of Spain has been damaged by the management of the COVID crisis. And in relation to that, we can talk about another question, which is in this new context, how do you think we can support? We can increase pro-independent support both in Catalonia and in Europe?
I totally think that the COVID situation has damaged the image of Spain. With one single thing, that is the number of deaths in compared of the population. So we are even in a worse situation than in Italy, and this is you can see how other governments have issued, like for example in Portugal, that it's a state that it's very near us. So perhaps you can do less comparison with other countries that are more in the north, but a country like Portugal, that it's in the same peninsula, has dealt with it much more better, and it's in number of deaths has nothing to do with us, you know. And I think yes, this has really damaged the image of Spain. And it's not that something that I am happy about. Of course, I fight for independence, but it's not something that I find it cool, because it has to do with death of people. And how can we, when we go out of this crisis, or during this period of crisis that is going to begin, how can we deal in order to fight for independence, to convince people to be for our cause? I would say that we have much more possibilities to show people how we. I would say that for me, one of the reasons for that I am independentist is because I want that people live better. So I think that it's, for me now, it's much easier to convince someone in the way on the best way to stop this conflict, not only the economic crisis that we are going to have, but also the crisis with Spain. It's to have one state. It's much more easier for me, because I also think that the little governments are much more better to issue. It's easier to have a sovereignty in little governments, not in huge states. And also because I really feel that things could have been done differently here, and we have lot more new opportunities in how to rethink what we would like to be as a state. So and also, of course, the image of a government that, even though that it's a leftist government, doesn't have the capacity, because it's supposed to be a socialist party, that I never think that it was, because it has of socialist what I have of I don't know, whatever, of something that I am not. So for me, it's not a left government. It's not working as a left government, and I think that even the left government in Spain, how they have dealt with the army, with taking consideration all the things that our president Torra asked him to consider that it was nothing to do with independence, was to do with the health of people, and he misled totally what our president was asking. So I think if that is happening with the left government, okay, when we had the right state, we said, okay, they are right and so on. But even with the left government, with Podemos inside, it's happening this in the worst of the situation than in a pandemic issue. I think it's very, at least for me, I think it's kind of easy to convince people why should we have a state, no? Because even in the worst situation, they don't have they don't have any type of consideration, you know. I don't know, how do you see it from outside, Claire?
Yeah, no,
But I see it like this.
it's a really interesting analysis. I suppose from my point of view, I don't know, I suppose the countries that seem to have come out of it the worst would be probably the USA and the UK, where they completely dismissed it at the start and have paid a really heavy price now in terms of deaths and so on because of denialism, really, rather than incompetence at the start. They really made it worse. There was a meeting in the Parliament this morning where evidence was given to say that they're at the moment, the one country in Europe, Bulgaria, the situation is actually still getting worse, and in 4 of them it's not getting any better, and that would be Sweden, Romania, the UK and Poland. But obviously Spain is not on either of those lists, so I don't know. But what I do know is, I do know from some people in Catalonia that there is a perception, and maybe this feeds into your second point, that a Catalan government were much quicker off the mark, were much more decisive, and that, you know, had they been given more, I suppose, independence or whatever, would have dealt with it better. I mean, I could see how people would certainly see that out of the present crisis. I mean, in terms of, you know, whether that will lead to more people demanding independence or whatever, you know, obviously it's not up to me to decide the fate of people in Catalonia. That's a matter to leave in your own capable hands, and the rest of the world should just to allow you to exercise that and not interfere and not support any sides that would seek to repress you in that, like, and to stand up for, I suppose, respect for democratic rights in that regard. So I don't know how they've done. I think a lot of governments are going to be shown up badly for this, really, apart from the Spanish one, you know.
Well, this seems to be the end of this talk. Thank you very much, Claire, for being here with us. We're really thankful of this. Well, it's truly been really interesting and insightful, having a perspective from the European Parliament and another country on the global crisis. And thank you to Ariadna too for being here with us. And that's it. Thank you very much. I hope seeing everyone who is watching us on the next talks we host.
Great to meet you all. Okay. Thank you very much.
Great to meet you, Claire. It was a pleasure.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.